Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on pay structures. My name is Tim Kellett. I'm from Paydata, and thank you very much for joining us today and for today's hour-long webinar. As I said, I'm Tim Kellett, and I'd like to introduce you to my colleague Joe Price. And Joe heads up a lot of our sort of reward consultancy work, which includes helping organisations to develop their pay structures. So I will hand over to Joe now, and he's going to take you through the rest of the webinar. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. Just a quick look at the some of the main areas that we're going to look at today. So we're going to talk about ensuring there is alignment between the business HR and reward strategies in terms of any pay structure that you might be thinking about introducing. I'm going to talk you through the different types of grade and pay structure. So there's a few different choices, and I'll talk you through the sort of pros and cons of each and why you might consider one over the other. I'm going to talk to you about job evaluation versus no job evaluation, balancing internal pay equity with market competitiveness, deciding what market position to adopt, and managing pay progression within a clear and transparent structure. Just before I move on, you may have seen it at the beginning of the presentation, but there is a Q&A sort of functionality on the webinar today. So we won't be able to hear you, but if you could add any questions as we go through the presentation, just add your questions to the Q&A part, and we'll stop at about 10 to answer as many questions as we can for you. So So in terms of key considerations when developing a pay structure, I'm just going to first of all take a step back and explain to you the process that we use here within Paydata when helping customers develop a pay structure. And essentially, when we're developing a pay structure, we're designing something. And as a result, we use design thinking, essentially. So you can see the process in front of you on your screen. And those of you familiar with design thinking will kind of probably recognize some of these elements or all of these elements. And essentially, we break it down into three main phases. And basically, each main phase consists of two sub-phases. And we always start with what we call the discovery phase. And the discovery phase, essentially, as it suggests, is all about, discovery, going into a phase of discovery, which basically consists of research and analysis. And this is about researching, the business and HR strategies, the wider business context, the types of skills and talent you might be needing to recruit, whether you want to reward internal equity versus market competitiveness, is all of those sorts of things. I will come on to talk about those in a little bit more detail in a minute. But essentially, it's about making sure that you do enough research to make sure that whatever design or whatever structure that you develop is based on facts. It's based on evidence, really. So we're really talking about evidence-based decision making. So the next part of the phase, once you've done the discovery, so once you've done your research and analysis, this is the phase that most people would naturally sort of think of when they're thinking about developing or designing a pay structure. It's the design phase and the actual implementation. So what we're doing in here is we're taking the information or the facts and the information and the insights from the discovery phase, and we're using that to help shape the design of the pay structure itself. So, whether we want to go for narrow grades, whether we want to go for broad grades, job evaluation, no job evaluation, all of those design choices should be led by the information and insights from the discovery phase. Of course, when you've designed something, there's a bit of a desktop exercise. You design it on paper, you create models, you create things in spreadsheets and so on. You actually then have to implement that. So I'll talk to you about that as well as we get later into the presentation. That's about the key considerations in terms of how you go about implementing it, what you need to consider, how you make changes within your own organization. It's all of those sorts of things. So that's the creation phase. And then lastly, we've got the review phase. And this is as equally important, because once you've implemented your pay structure, it's wise to periodically evaluate it to make sure that it is achieving the objectives that you set out from the very start. And it might be that it is working well, which is fantastic, but it could easily be that actually once it's been implemented, you discover it's not having the desired effect, or there's certain elements that potentially could be reviewed or refined. So that's the review phase, really. And all three of those are, in our view, absolutely essential when you're developing a pay structure. Now, more often than not, people will usually just jump into the creation phase and forget about the review phase. We often get people come to us and they'll say something along the lines of, we want to introduce job evaluation. We want to introduce a narrow graded structure. Can you make it happen for us? And we say, yeah, that's fantastic. We can certainly help you. But how did you come to that decision? And sometimes people might say to us, well, our CEO, that's what they said they wanted. They had a similar structure in their previous organization, and they think it would work well in our organization. And we always challenge a little bit there, because even two organizations within the same sector doing very similar things actually will probably have different strategies. They'll certainly have different cultures. They'll certainly have different values. So we always encourage the customer to take a step back and say, okay, well, that's what you think you might need now, but let's do a little bit of research. Let's do a discovery. Let's actually, determine whether that is the right approach for you. Because what works in one organization will not necessarily work in another organization, which is why it's very important to do that first piece. Likewise, the review phase is equally as important, because quite often we've seen companies come to us and they'll say, something's not quite working with our pay structure, or we're having issues. And it's because there's been no sort of periodic or systematic sort of evaluation and review. And it sometimes can get to a state actually where it needs, quite a lot of work. Whereas if they'd have had a review earlier on, maybe they could have, come up with some interventions that wouldn't require such a big project. So the main sort of phase is discovery, creation, review. And I'm going to go through these with you now in a little bit more detail. So the discovery phase. So what should you be researching? So this isn't an exhaustive list. These are the main things we think you should consider. But by all means, if there's other things relevant to the context of your own organization, then include them in the research phase. But some of the main things to consider you can see here. So obviously business and HR strategy is very important. You need to make sure that any pay structure that you're developing, that you're designing, is aligned to the business and HR strategies. The same is true about culture and values. Your pay structure needs to support your culture and values. What you don't want to do is introduce something that actually sort of goes against your culture and your values. It's sort of detrimental to your culture and values. So it's very, very important to start off by looking at the business and HR strategies, at the culture and values. What is the organization trying to achieve? What behaviors does it expect? What behaviors does it think are critical in order to succeed? The next thing is around key business drivers. So this is about, how does the organization measure success? Of course, there's going to be a financial element in there, but there's going to be other things in there as well, such as customer satisfaction, customer feedback. It could be sort of product innovation, having sort of, making sure that you're at the forefront of products and services within your particular sector. A key business driver could also be employee engagement. So it's about really understanding what those key business drivers are, how they're decimated through the organization, how they in turn determine how people should be behaving. It's all of those sorts of things that you kind of want to be considering and researching at this stage, and making sure that you've got a full understanding, that you're not making any assumptions. It's very important not to make any assumptions based on facts and based on evidence. Customer value, obviously very important. How do you create value for your customers? Is it through product innovation? Is it through optimization in terms of like low costs, for example? Is it through customer intimacy? All of those things are important because it helps you understand the behaviors that you need. It helps you understand the skills that you might need. And of course, if you're looking for certain behaviors, if you're looking for certain skills, you're trying to create a certain type of culture, your pay structure can support all of those things. Another important thing to consider is the type of talent skills the organization is trying to attract and retain. How broad is that talent? Are you having to attract and retain talent from many different sectors, from many different industries, from a wide range of organizations, or actually is it quite narrow? That will also help you determine what type of market data you need to use, because of course, we're looking at pay structures here. Certainly we're going to be bringing in data into this at some point. So understanding what type of talent you're looking for, the type of skills you're trying to attract, what they're also looking for will help you when it comes to developing the pay structure. Now, competitor market information is important. Obviously, when you're looking at market data, you want to be able to understand what the average salaries are in the market, the lower, the upper quartile, and all of that type of stuff. You also want an idea of what your competitors are doing. Now, to my point a few minutes ago, you don't want to replicate your competitors unless there's a good reason to, because actually what works for them might not work for you. But it's good to have an idea of what they're doing and certainly consider it. And you can either consider the merits of copying them or not. But I'd say more often than not, it needs to be it's more around your context and around your own organization. But it's good to know what they are doing as well from a sort of pay structure perspective. The current and desired market position is about understanding essentially where you sit in the market now. So on average, are you a median payer, for example? So this is about going away and researching your pay rates and comparing them to the market and doing that analysis and understanding where you currently are, and then understanding where you want to be. And I'll talk about this later, but for instance, you might want to move from being on average a median payer to on average an upper quartile payer. But you might want to get there over time, for example. So it's about understanding where you are currently and where you need to be, and then building that into the pay structure. Equally as important as market is internal equity. And this is obviously about, making sure that you don't have any internal equity issues, researching whether you think, for instance, there are any potential pockets where there might be, an unequal pay issue, for instance, so it's just looking at that and determining whether actually we do, there is potentially an issue or there potentially isn't, because that's going to help you as well. Because if you're concerned around sort of equal pay and internal equity and equal pay for sort of work of equal value, if that's either high up on your agenda, either through diversity, either through your diversity inclusion agenda or just part of your wider HR strategy, then you need to be thinking, okay, actually, potentially internal equity and job size is maybe more important to us as an organization than the market. So I'm not saying ignore the market, and I'll explain what I mean by that later, but it's about saying where do we want the focus of the structure to be, and it could well be in internal equity. So the next thing on the list there is the current approach to things like grading and how pay decisions are made. So, what do you currently do? And a really important one that often gets, I suppose, potentially overlooked is about the opinions of employees and managers. What do they want? So you could get this information from employee surveys. So for example, engagement surveys such as Best Companies will often have a section on there around pay. It will often ask people whether they feel fairly paid relative to other jobs in the market and relative to other similar sized jobs internally. And, you can use that data to then help inform what your pay structure might look like. But it's also about asking them potentially actually how, if you're moving to a pay structure where you want to build in some form of individual pay progression, it's about asking employees what they think is important. What do they think pay progression should be based on? Because they might have a different view than the senior management team, for example, and it's good to take that all into account. And the same goes for managers. What do managers feel is the most important? For example, if we use pay progression example, what do they think pay progression should be based on? So it's really important to involve employees and to involve managers right from the outset and get their opinions to help shape the, whatever structure you decide to design. Legislation, obviously very important. You need to make sure that any structure you put into place complies with all relevant legislation. So, just research what the latest legislation is saying. And of course, it goes without saying, but anything that you introduce needs to be affordable. So, if you're looking at moving from a median to an upper quartile pay position on average, is that actually affordable? Can you do it in one go, or do you need to phase that over a number of years? And if you phase it over a number of years, do you make it contingent on the organization hitting its profit targets, for example? So of course, affordability, it all needs to be within the envelope of affordability. So those are the main things that we would suggest at a minimum you look at during the sort of research phase. So once you've got all that data, of course, it's essentially raw data. You need to analyze it. You need to organize it. You need to, put in the tables into charts, to, all of that kind of stuff, to be able to pick out the main insights and the main trends, because they will help you answer a number of questions, and it's the answer to those questions that you will use then to help you shape the actual design of your pay structure. So the analysis should result in the number of questions being answered. So again, it's not an exhaustive list, but it's just an idea of the sorts of things that you should know as a result of doing the research and doing the analysis. Is what are the organization's short and long-term priorities? I know that might sound obvious, but actually, in our experience, we do go into a lot of organizations and there is confusion even at a senior level about what the organization's short and long-term priorities are. So it's very important to make sure there's absolute clarity right the way through the organization about what those long and short-term priorities are. What does the organization value? So this is about things in terms of, this could be behaviors, this could be going back to the customer value. It's like if an organization has a strategy around customer intimacy, therefore it values really knowing what their customers want, almost anticipating what they want before they've actually asked for it. And that requires certain skills, it requires certain knowledge, it requires certain behaviors. So what does the organization value? Also under that question, you're going to be looking at things like, okay, as an organization, do we value internal equity more? Do we value external equity more? So market competitive versus sort of internal equity job size, or actually do we want to sort of strike a balance between the two? So it's looking at all those sorts of things. From a pay progression perspective, do we value individual performance more? Do we value team performance? Is it a mixture? Do we value skills attainment? Do we value behaviors? It's all of those sorts of things that you need to know the answer to in order to be able to help shape your pay structure. What type of talent skills does this organization need to successfully develop its strategy? This is going to help you because it will help you determine what market data you need to use. It will help you potentially shape your pay structure about the needs of those people, all of that stuff. So, really have a good understanding of what talent skills does your organization need to successfully deliver its business strategy. Who is the organization competing with for talent? Again, it's good to have a very clear idea of this, because again, it will help you determine what data you need to use. It will help you determine potentially what market position you need to use, all of that kind of stuff. What is the organization's current and desired market position? So we talked about that, didn't we? It's important to know where you currently are and where you aspire to be. And then you can do the analysis and the modeling to determine whether that is achievable and whether it needs to be phased or whether it can happen all in one go. And what do employees want, or what do managers want, is very, very important. And actually it's sort of as well, I'd also bring into this, what do potential employees want? So, if you think about your wider EVP, it's shaped around not only the needs of your employees, but also the types of employees or potential employees you were trying to attract. So it's all it's about getting insights and the data to be able to answer this questions and many more questions, because it's that information that you will then use as we come to the next phase. So this is about the creation phase now. We're now starting to get into the detailed design work of our pay structure. And as you can imagine, if we hadn't have gone through that discovery phase, this phase would become a lot harder. We'd probably be having to guess, or make assumptions, or our beliefs or our opinions on how it should be designed might be based on a limited circle of opinion. So it's very important that you do that first when you come to the design phase. It really will help you in the long run. So the sort of main steps really in the design phase, as you can see in your screen there. So the first bit is assess. So we suggest the truth is there is actually a limited number of pay structure choices. And I'm going to go through those with you, the main ones in a minute in a little bit more detail. So it's about looking at those main structure choices and determining, based on the information that you have from the discovery phase, which is the best one for your organization. So you obviously select the most appropriate pay structure based on that. And then the sort of last part, I suppose, in the creation sort of design phase is the personalization. So, that within reason, you can personalize each structure a little bit to meet the context and strategy and values and culture of your own organization. So there is a little bit of personalization that you can do at the end as well. So assess, select, personalize. So let's have a look at the main pay structure choices. So you can see them on your screen now. So from the left, you've got pay ladder. Then we've got narrow grades or a narrow graded structure, broad grades, broad graded structure, and then at the end there you've got job families. Now I would say that narrow grades, broad grades, and job families are probably the most popular or common types of pay structure. Pay ladders less so, but they are actually they're a good choice in certain situations. So it's probably a good place for us to start. So basically, a pay ladder is very straightforward, very easy structure to sort of understand. You basically just have a series of sequential pay points that are created using market data. And what you do is you simply just hang jobs off the ladder. So each pay point, if you can imagine, is a step on a ladder, hence the reason the name pay ladder. And you might be thinking, it looks quite similar to, for those of you that have or do work in the public sector, it might be quite similar to a pay spine, and it is. Obviously, the similarity is that sequential list of pay points. But the difference between what we refer to as a pay ladder and sort of traditional pay spine is that pay spines usually hang grades off the pay points, whereas we tend to hang individual jobs or groupings of jobs off the ladder. So basically, what you would do is, for instance, if you had a job for a HR administrator, you'd look at the sort of like the market rate for that job. So you get some data and you'd say the average salary for HR administrator is 25,000, for example, and then you would hang that job off the closest pay points to that 25,000. And then, as you can see, you've got a number of steps in there. So what you do is you might say, okay, well, we're going to hang the sort of 25,000 off the first step in the ladder, and then we'll provide 2 more steps in the ladder to provide some scope for pay progression, for example. Or you could do it the other way. So, this is where you've got a bit of flexibility. You could put the 25,000 at the top and say that the first rung in the ladder is like the entry level rate, and that over time they'll get to this 25,000, which will be aligned to the median. So that's the main difference, really, or one of the main differences. The other main difference between a pay ladder and a pay spine is traditionally pay spines were service-based increments. So you'd usually go up to the next increment on the anniversary of the date you join the organization. We always make the step up the ladder contingent on something. And it's quite a good system to couple with skills attainment, because what you can actually do is create profiles for each step on the ladder relevant to each job, and you can make the step up to the next pay point contingent on skills attainment, for example. So there's no automatic service-based increments when we tend to introduce this type of structure into organizations. So some sort of small differences, but quite important differences, hence the reason we refer to them as pay ladders. Now, what sort of organization would be suited to this type of structure? Well, if you want an easy to manage pay structure, because it's relatively easy, you just create a list of sequential pay points and hang jobs off based on data. And obviously it provides a clear and direct framework within which to manage pay decisions. So using the example around skills attainment, you can create some very clear profiles around what skills look like at each of the different steps in the ladder, and you make it contingent on that, which means that it's good for organizations that are worried about the capability of their line managers to make those decisions, because it's quite prescribed, and or don't have a sophisticated performance management system. That's why it's good for, it provides a clear and direct framework. Having said that, to create the profiles themselves, there's quite a lot of work involved up front, but once you've done that, it's pretty straightforward. The other, sorts of organizations this might appeal to, if you have a public sector background or culture, because as I said, these sorts of systems are have a familiar look and feel to some of the public sector. And if you have a strong trade unions tend to quite like this type of structure, because it's clear, it's easy to understand. The trade unions and employees can be involved in the creation of those skills profiles, for example. So that's the sort of, if you're through your research, you might sort of think, okay, well, yeah, we our culture is, we do come from a public sector background, or we've got a strong trade union. Actually, we're worried about the capability of our line managers. If you've sort of discovered all those things through your research stage, then potentially this is one you may want to consider.
And Joe,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I was going to say, we've seen this sort of being quite common in sort of sectors such as healthcare, for example, where there's, the agenda for change is very much similar sort of design, isn't it? And ex-public sector housing associations sometimes. Is that sort of correct?
Yeah, that's right. It appeals to people that have, so for instance, if you're working for an independent healthcare organization, but there's clearly strong links to the NHS, because that might be where you get your people from. You don't necessarily want to replicate the agenda for change scales, but you could put in something that sort of has some familiarity, but is in the context of your own organization. So you're right, Tim, or housing associations, for example. So two good examples. So that brings us then to the next structure on our list. So this is narrow grades. So this is probably the most, when you think of a pay structure, this is probably sort of, without realizing, the one that most people would think of, I say. So this will consist of like 10 or more what we refer to as narrow grades. Another name for them is single grades. Why? Because each grade contains jobs of broadly equivalent value. Okay, so if you imagine that each grade is a group, and then each group contains jobs of, sort of the same size, really. And this type of pay structure may be suited to organizations that value internal equity, want to primarily reward job size, want to use analytical job evaluation to make grading decisions, and want a framework to help manage internal relativities. Because you're basically saying that actually, all jobs of the same size are going to be in the same grade. Well, essentially, what you're doing then is you're saying, well, actually, we want to primarily reward job size. And if you want to reward job size, if job size is your focus, then you're left with no choice really than to use analytical job evaluation to make those grading decisions, because there really isn't another way to actually get to get to a single level, or to get to a single grade, without using analytical job evaluation. Now, of course, you could make this decisions without any system, but there'd be no rigor behind that. It wouldn't stand up, for instance, in an equal pay tribunal. It'd be sort of subjective rather than objective. So if you want a robust, objective way to determine which jobs are of equal value, there is really no other way to use analytical job evaluation. So by choosing this type of structure, you are by default also probably choosing an analytical job evaluation. So, it's great for helping manage internal relativities, because all jobs of the same size have access to, usually the same pay range. So usually each grade will have a pay range. So it becomes much easier to manage internal relativities. It becomes much easier to meet your equal pay obligations. Now, you might be thinking, no, that sounds fantastic. That's all the things that we're interested in, but we're also concerned about the market. Well, I'm not saying you don't consider the market in this type of structure, but the primary focus is job size. Now, each grade will have a pay range, and to create that pay range, you will use market data. So you use up-to-date, relevant, robust market data. So actually, if you need to in certain situations, you can sort of, choose where to pay somebody within that range, sort of based on the market. But what I would say is that, normally what people do is they sort of, bring people in, and, try and bring people in to a grade, a consistent level, and let them work their way up. Now, you might sort of come into issues with this type of structure. For instance, because they're narrow grades, therefore the ranges themselves are a little bit narrower in nature. You might get an instance where you have a particular job and the market rate for that role exceeds the top of the range for the role's grade. Obviously, because the primary focus of this is internal equity and job size, and whilst the ranges are market led, you sometimes might get that situation. Now, as an organization, you've got a few choices you need to make. You either say, no, we've decided on this approach, and internal equity is what we believe in and what we value. Therefore, we'll go to the top of the relevant range, but we won't exceed it. You know, we'll stick to what we've said, and we will find somebody that can fit within that range, or will come and work for us within that range. Because don't forget, people have a choice to make, don't they? And if you say that you value internal equity, if you say that the reason you value internal equity is because, you know, diversity and inclusion is very important to your organization, equal pay for equal work is very important, all of those sorts of things, that's going to be attractive to some people. Therefore, you know, they're still going to come. So, you know, you might take the view that we'll find somebody and we'll find the right person for us within that range. Other organizations might take a different approach, and they'll say, do you know what, let's take an example, cybersecurity expert. We need, you know, there's just, you know, we need to pay above the range. We just don't think we're going to find a person if we don't pay this particular salary. And in that instance, what you can do is you can say, okay, well, we'll make an exception here, provided the exception is based on facts and evidence. You know, you need to support that view about the salary through data. You can't just be a subjective view, we think they get paid more. You have to know that they get paid more, and you have to have exhausted every avenue. And in that situation, what you can do is maybe pay like a market supplement or a market premium, but they have to be the exceptions rather than the rules, really, if you choose to go down this route. Now, if you find that you're in a situation where, you know, it's just you've got lots of market premiums and market supplements, then maybe it might not be the right structure for you. And there are other choices which we'll come on to in a moment. So, as a general rule, you know, nothing's absolute, but as a general rule, this type of structure will suit organizations that value internal equity, primarily want to reward job size. There is a nod to the market, but it's primarily reward job size, and want to use analytical job evaluation to make grading decisions, equal pay for equal work, if you like. Which brings us on to the next structure, which is broad grades. Now, essentially, the way that the broad grades, as the name suggests, are broader than the narrow grades, and as a consequence, there are less grades in the structure. Because essentially what you do to create broad grades is you sort of combine two narrow grades. So basically in each broad grade, you've essentially got two levels of work, if you like. So you can see already the shift that we've taken. We've come away from essentially job size, haven't we? We've come away from those bandings of equal value, and we've sort of collapsed them to create these broad grades that, whilst the you know, they're not wildly different in terms of job size, they are different, which basically means that this type of pay structure may be suited to organizations that value market competitiveness, wants to primarily reward the value of the job holder. So what is that job worth in the market? What particular skills and experiences does the job holder have that we need to recognize and reward? So you can see that we've taken a shift here. We've gone from narrow grades, where the primary focus is around job size, to broad grades, where the primary focus tends to be the job holder and the market value. This type of structure might be suited to organizations that don't want to use analytical job evaluation. I'll come on to that after, but you've got a choice with broad grades. You can use it, or you can use something a bit more light touch. So again, that might be through the research phase, you've identified that job evaluation analytical job evaluation might not be right for your organization's culture. And therefore, you know, you might be more interested in this type of structure. And again, you want a framework to help manage external relativities. And the reason that this structure can help you do that is because the grades are broader, and therefore, you know, if you're using ranges, if they're essentially broader, it means you've got more scope to look at what jobs are worth in the market. You've got more scope to reward the value of that actual individual job holder. So, you know, you go to market, somebody applies for the job, and they've got a particular set of skills and unique experience, and they're almost commanding their own market rate. So, you know, it kind of sits above the market rate for the job. So essentially, broader ranges, more flexibility, more scope to value market competitiveness. Of course, what do you lose with broad grades? You lose that it's much harder to manage or to ensure you're meeting your equal pay obligations. So there isn't a right and a wrong with any of these approaches. You're always balancing one thing against each other. So you're sort of running a bit more risk with this type of structure. But lots of organizations will say to themselves, we're happy to carry that risk because we've got the evidence to support, you know, around taking this more market based approach. So that's the sort of, I suppose, you're balancing those two things off against each other. So if you think about narrow grades, primarily more suited to job size with some view to the market, whereas broad grades primarily around rewarding the value of the job holder. Although, you do still have some grades in there as well. So there's a little nod to job size, but not at the same level as narrow grades. So those are the main differences really. And it's about making a choice based on the information that you've already collected. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, actually, we sort of value both equally, or as equally as realistically possible. We totally believe in equal pay for equal work and job size, but we also are competing in a market where or we're so diverse as an organization, we cannot ignore market competitiveness, which brings us on to our last choice. This is job families. So in a job family structure, essentially what you do is you group jobs into families based on shared characteristics. So in terms of skills, in terms of talent, in terms of pay characteristics, in terms of the markets that maybe where you're recruiting them from. And I've just put an example on here that two families, for instance, commercial and engineering, and I don't know if you'd noticed, but these are actually sort of narrow grades. Now you can use broad grades in the job family structure as well, but it's more common to use narrow grades. And what you're doing here is you're saying, okay, we're operating in diverse markets. The pay rates are so different that it would be too hard for us to have a single narrow graded structure. But we also do believe very strongly in internal equity. So what you do is you group them based on the sort of markets that they're facing off against, and you sort of achieve, I suppose, a sweet spot between market competitiveness, because it's the data and the jobs and everything are coming from the same market, but then within those families you're achieving a degree of internal equity within those families, because jobs within a family within the same grade are deemed to be the same size, and therefore they have access to the same pay range. So it comes back to equal pay for equal work in a job family setting. So if the job families are fantastic from that perspective. They really sort of balance the two really effectively. I suppose the only thing that you need to consider with job families, again, coming back to the pros and cons, is that obviously it's a more complex type of structure. It can be harder to explain to people, and it requires more maintenance and upkeep and those sorts of things. So it's really good, but there are sorts of things that you need to consider. So this type of pay structure may be suited to organizations that operate in a diverse range of markets, as we discussed. So the pay. So as an example, we were talking about housing associations before. Some housing associations, particularly the larger ones that are doing their own development, building their own houses for their own stock, but also for private sale. This is quite an appealing structure for those types of organizations, because if you can imagine traditional housing association type organization, it's a very different recruitment and pay market than the private house building market. But housing associations now are having to attract and retain people from the private house building sector. So one structure probably isn't going to work for people doing their own development. What you need to do is say, okay, actually, we've got a family over here, which is our more traditional housing association family, and we're going to have grades and ranges that are relevant to that sector. And then over here, we're going to have, a development family, for instance, and it will enable us to attract and retain the best from the private house building sector. And basically what will happen is that each of those families will have different pay arrangements that are suited to the different recruitment labor markets that you're trying to recruit and retain people from. So where you're operating in a diverse range of markets, you have a diverse range of operating models. For instance, that could be sort of your products and services could be quite different, requiring different operating models. So it could be that, or it could be geographic, for instance. It's those sorts of things really.
Joe, yep. Could you combine a number of different types of jobs? So in that example with housing associations, you might have the development roles, and you might also have IT roles. And so you define, you actually have like maybe a market premium job family where for similar levels there's a sort of premium charge compared with other support roles, and so you have so you can group roles based on the market premium, just like geographically you could have London and the rest of UK. Is that yeah?
You could, yeah, you absolutely could. You're right, Tim. So again, there isn't a right and a wrong with how many families you have, and even the composition of those families. So some people take a more functional route. Some people might take a more sort of business unit route, or other organizations, as you say, might say, we've got a group of jobs here that we know carry a premium, for example, and these are the jobs, and therefore these are the jobs where the market is just slightly different. And it comes back to the beginning, really, around, understanding what jobs you employ, understanding the data that, the data that you need, how you compare to the market, where you need to be, all those sorts of things will then help inform what families you have, how many families you have, and who goes into what family. So there isn't necessarily an absolute right and wrong. The only thing I would say is that we try and aim for, or we try and adopt the less is more approach. Job families by their very nature are quite complex anyway. Therefore, if you've got lots and lots of job families, it arguably makes it unnecessarily complex. So we go for some sort of simplicity wherever possible. This sort of pay structure might be suited to organizations that want a framework to clearly define career paths, because we've been focusing obviously on pay, but of course within the families, if you've got groups, for instance, with similar types of skills, actually you can really start to then to define clear career paths. So basically it's very, job families are very supportive in terms of helping to provide a framework for career planning and development. They arguably are more supportive than the other types of structures, because things are already starting to be broken down into groupings where they share similar skills and characteristics. So absolutely fantastic for supporting that type of stuff. And also organizations that have multiple cultures might want to think of this. So, for example, going back to the housing association example, because it's a good one, we have found that sometimes there can be, a bit of a difference in culture between the development part of a housing association and also the more traditional housing association side. And that, in the development part, it might be more of a culture that's based on, high variable and, quite aggressive targets. And, if you're not performing, you're out. Whereas in the housing association side, maybe it might not be the case. So, if you've got multiple cultures as well. So hopefully you can sort of start to see that job families really do provide a lot of flexibility. They can help you recognize different things, and they provide a really nice sweet spot between sort of job size and external market competitiveness. So those are the main pay structure choices, if you like. And as we said before, it's about going through and selecting which is, you feel is the most appropriate one based on the individual needs and context of your organization. But there is a little bit of personalization that can also happen. And I'll very quickly sort of just go through the potential sort of personalization choices that you've got. So first one is job evaluation. Now, often people think it's a choice between job evaluation or no job evaluation, but we think that if you're looking at any of the pay structures or considering any of the pay structures that we've just looked at, your organization is probably of a certain size and sophistication that actually requires something. So we think that the choices between really analytical job evaluation and non-analytical job evaluation, and in some respects, the choice of structure almost dictates this to you. So as I said, narrow grades, really, you've got no other choice between, you really have to use analytical job evaluation in order to be able to get to those groupings of equal value. Whereas sort of non-analytical job evaluation, this is something like a classification scheme. So apologies, just very quickly. Analytical job evaluation, as you probably all know, but just to confirm, is a process of breaking whole jobs down into a number of defined factors. So it's looking at it at different factors and consistently breaking each job down and doing that consistently. For example, our own pay grade job evaluation methodology looks at the following factors: knowledge and expertise, scope, impact, complexity, and communication and influencing. And that's why it's called analytical, because it breaks it down. It gives you that level of analysis. Whereas non-analytical job evaluation enables whole jobs to be compared in order to place them in a grade or level. So essentially, this is like a classification scheme. You could have some sort of generic profiles where you just match jobs to, but you're not breaking them down into those factors that you would do on an analytical side. So that's the main differences between the two. So analytical job evaluation can be seen, I don't agree with this, but it can be seen as overly bureaucratic and time consuming, which is why some organizations are a little bit hesitant to maybe introduce it, but it's the only way to know if work is truly of equal value and therefore can provide a defence in an equal pay tribunal. Whereas non-analytical job evaluation, such as a classification scheme, is arguably quicker and simpler to use than analytical job evaluation. But because it's not analytical in nature, it cannot provide a defence in an equal pay tribunal. So you've got to balance those things up. So it's not law to have an analytical job evaluation system, but it is law to make sure that you're meeting your equal pay obligations. So sort of a bit contradictory. Now, organizations will choose to run the risk of going without analytical because they feel they can justify it through a material factor such as market rates, which is fine, but make sure that is based on evidence to safeguard yourselves. So narrow grades analytical job evaluation, so no real choice there. But when you come to broad grades, you do have a choice. You can either use analytical job evaluation or non-analytical job evaluation. So you've got a bit of a choice there. With regards to the pay ladder, as I said, we hang jobs off the pay ladder as opposed to grades. So you probably wouldn't need anything from a grading perspective, but actually, depending on what market data you need access to and what jobs you employ, you might find job evaluation useful. So for example, there's many different sources of market data: club surveys, salary surveys, online data, recruitment boards, all of those. But one big source of market data is a consultant's database. And those databases are often structured in classification, some sort of classification and some sort of leveling methodology. And if you're needing to get data from a database such as that, then analytical job evaluation will really help you ensure that you're making a like-for-like comparison with the data in that database. So again, it comes back down to what data do you need, what jobs do you employ, and so on. So with a pay ladder, analytical job evaluation might be useful for getting access to the sort of relevant market data. Now, of course, with job families, if you go with job families and you use narrow grades, then you're going to have to use analytical job evaluation. But if you go with job families with broad grades, for example, you have the choice. So that's one of the sort of things that you need to consider, one of the main considerations. The next consideration is around pay ranges or spot rates. So obviously the pay ladder is a sequential list of pay points. So that sort of stands on its own, really. It's not really a relevant choice for that type of structure. But for the others, it potentially is. So normally, most often when we're developing one of the main sort of, where we're developing narrow grades or broad grades or job families, we usually sort of 8-9 times out of 10 will create pay ranges. And basically pay ranges set the minimum, the maximum salary for each grade, and then they're usually developed using market data to inform the midpoint around which the spread is created. And that midpoint is usually aligned to your desired market position, which we'll come on to in a moment. But for example, the median, and you create a range that way. And pay progression is usually managed through sub ranges. So usually we will do pay ranges. However, if you're implementing broad grades, you do have a choice, because as I said before, it's more of a market based approach, and therefore you could use spot rates in a broad graded structure. And basically spot rates set the rate of pay for each job. So basically each job would have a spot rate that links to the market. It could be that the spot rate is linked to the median or the up quartile, low quartile. Again, that's your choice. And each job would have that spot rate. I suppose that the one of the downsides of going down the spot rate route is that whereas ranges are created using market data, you don't need market data for every single role to create a range. Whereas if you're using spot rates, you do. So it puts a hell of a lot of pressure on having reliable market data for every single job in the structure. But for some organizations that don't employ a wide range of roles and they're quite clearly defined, spot rates can be appealing. So again, this choice probably is more appropriate to broad grades. Could you have spot rates in a narrow graded structure? In theory, you could, but of course, if you did that, you'd be going down the more market route. Therefore, it brings into question whether narrow grades is the right approach. And generally, spot rates, comparator ratios are used to manage pay progressions, as opposed to ranges and sub-ranges. You're using comparator ratios just to manage pay progression. So again, a bit of personalization there, but more so probably more applicable for broad graded structure. Now, another important consideration is market definition and market definition and position, sorry. So market definition is about primarily understanding where employees are typically recruited from and where they typically go when they leave the organization. So this is really helpful because it will help you understand where you need to be, what sort of data that you need to help with your pay structure. Where are you, what sort of data, what sort of roles and that type of stuff. And in most businesses, operate in more than one market. So you're probably going to be looking at multiple sources of data from multiple markets. So it's about clearly understanding when you refer to the market, what do you mean? And then, of course, market position is about how you want to position your pay against the market. So adopting the appropriate market position is a strategic decision. So, this is about saying, on average, we want to be a median employer. On average, we want to be an upper quartile employer. Now, it's a bit of a myth that a higher market position will guarantee you higher performance. It's not true, because it doesn't guarantee anything. It doesn't guarantee you will get the best people, and it doesn't guarantee upper quartile performance. A lot of people think it does, but what it does do is a higher market position increases the pool of people who will be attracted by your offer. So it widens the net, and it decreases the pool of organizations that can match your offer. So it helps with recruitment and retention, but it won't guarantee that you will always get the best people. You have to make sure that you've got robust recruitment and policies and processes and so on in place. So sorry, I'm rushing a little bit here because I'm just conscious of time. So next up, we've got pay progression. So most pay systems provide some basis for pay progression. So when you're looking at the pay structures that we've looked at, usually most of them will provide some basis for pay progression. Otherwise, it brings into question why you need a pay structure if you're not providing basis for pay progression. The basis for progression must be explicitly linked to the organization's strategy and values. Key consideration is whether to have a direct and indirect link to performance. So, I won't go into this now because we could have a whole other session on this, but as you'll be aware that there's a debate around appraisal ratings versus non-appraisal ratings and all of that type of stuff. So it's about thinking about that, what's right for your organization, and so on and so on. And of course, very important, people's and systems capability is also important consideration. So back to the point I made about the pay ladder, if you don't think that you have the line management capability and or the sophisticated enough systems and processes internally, then you might be wanting to explore something along the pay ladder route where it's a little bit easier. So it's people and systems capability is very important. So those are the sort of main sort of choices. So once you've selected your main pay structure, those are the sort of things that you need to be considering. Then it's about implementation. So what I've talked to you about sort of so far is relatively, that's the easy bit relatively, because actually, you're doing modeling, you're creating things, you're doing research, you're doing design. As you will all know, the hardest part of any of this is the implementation, because it represents change, and change is hard to implement. You'll all know the statistics about how successful change projects are. So it's really, really important to give this the focus and the attention it deserves. So obviously create a detailed project plan. Communication and involvement are key. Consider piloting the new structure in a specific part of the organization, particularly if you're a large organization. Consider the legal implications. How do you manage the change? What can you change and what do you have to consult on? Is there a trade union? Is there not a trade union? It's all of those sorts of things. So don't forget the legal implications. And don't forget about training. If you're moving to a system where there is going to be a requirement for managers to manage pay progression themselves, don't forget to train them. Don't forget to train employees. Give them the support and development that they need. And just very quickly on the communication and involve them in the design. Certainly I involve them in the discovery, but involve them in the design if you like, in terms of putting a working party together. Things tend to work better when they're inclusive. So there's no problem with getting their involvement in the design as well, and also the implementation. You want a group of ambassadors, for instance, among the employee workforce. And then very lastly, so sorry, apologies for rushing at the end here, but once you've kind of done that and you've designed it and you've implemented it and it's successfully in, hopefully, don't forget to review. Okay, so regular evaluation is needed to make sure the pay structure is working effectively and meets the needs of all stakeholders and remains fit for purpose. Organizations change, strategies change. It's all, you have to make sure that it continues to remain fit for purpose. It's important that any issues are identified and resolved quickly. Okay, so that's important. You don't want to sort of compound or consolidate issues and they just get worse and worse and worse over time. And it's also important to regularly review the market data underpinning the pay structure. So as we talked about, different data and stuff, regularly review that to make sure that it's up to date and it's relevant and you can recruit and retain the people you need. So that's, essentially sort of the main considerations for developing a pay structure.
Joe,
Sorry,
in terms of the market, updating the market data and things, I think most of our customers, review their pay structures every year. Update them every year. But some people do that maybe every 2 years, and they might just apply a general uplift every other year, perhaps. Is that sort of quite common? Do you think, in terms of reanalyzing, bringing in the market data? Most people tend to do it every year because the market changes every year.
Yeah, I think certainly we would never we would never suggest leaving it longer than 2 years. I think it depends again. If you're using spot rates, then you're going to have to do it every year, maybe even more than that, because again, back to the sort of it puts the pressure on that market data. If you're using ranges, I would say that ranges can, because you're creating a range around the median, they're probably a little bit, they can withstand changes in the market a bit more for their, because they're ranges. So I would say that spot rates, certainly at least annually. Ranges, we'd probably recommend annually, at least review them, not necessarily change them, but at least review them, but certainly look to be updating those ranges at, no less than sort of every 2 years, I would say, Tim.
Sorry, thank you, Joe.
No problem.
I just want to say we'll send out the slides for today. If right at the end here, so we've got maybe some questions, but what we'll do is we'll endeavour to answer every question afterwards as well, because we want to have a hard stop now. But if you want to put any questions in there, we'll record them and come back to you individually about them. Talking about recording, I'd also say that we'll send out a recording of today as well as the slides, so you can always sort of go back into that, really. So I think we have almost run out of time. I don't know, Joe, if you want to answer any questions while
I'll just answer. Well, as you say, Tim, apologies everybody, that's my fault. I ran slightly over, but if you add your questions to the board, we'll come back. We'll answer the questions in a bit more detail. But very quickly, just picking out a couple of questions. Somebody asked about, if IT roles are outside the range for a significant number of roles, would you suggest a separate job family? And I probably would. Because if you're sort of getting to a point where you've got a large number of roles, whether they be IT roles or something else, it probably suggests that you might need to go down the job family route. I think it's easier to do that rather than like market premiums, because if you've got market premiums for lots of different roles, again, it becomes much harder to manage. So I would, but we'll come back to you with a sort of detailed answer on that. Somebody said about narrow grades, and I mentioned job size. Is there a definition of job size? There is. It's basically jobs of equal value. So if you use job evaluation, basically what you will, or analytical job evaluation, the outcome will usually be a level, and all jobs that have the same level are considered to be the same size. So basically job size is about jobs of equal value, basically. And somebody's asked as well around how wide do you think a range should be around the median? Again, there isn't any right or wrong. Normally when we're designing a pay structure, we do modeling around kind of what's going to work, because often what you do is you need to you bring in the market data, and then you need to see how it compares to your internal pay rates, and you might need to adjust the pay ranges. But on a just as a rough idea, on a narrow graded structure, the range width might be 20 to 40%-ish, and on a broad graded structure it might be 30 to 60, something along those lines. But there isn't an absolute right and a wrong. You do the modeling and stuff to figure it out, but hopefully that gives you an idea of that one. So apologies everybody, we have got to 11, but we will come back and answer anybody that's sent in any questions. And of course, if anybody would like to get in contact and like to know more about any of what we've discussed today, please feel free to get in contact with us.
And thank you very much, Joe. It's really, really good that you've been able to share the benefit of your extensive experience. This is definitely on everyone's agendas at the moment, or a lot of people's agendas. Pay structure seems to be where most people are getting in contact with us at the moment. I guess it's just the sort of situation of where we're at with post-COVID and looking ahead to the future, and definitely getting some sort of rigor there, both internally and market competitive externally, seems to be what sort of on a lot of people's agendas. So hope you found it very useful. I certainly found it very interesting as well. So thanks again, Joe. Have a good rest of the day, everyone. And as Joe said, if you've got any questions, any further questions, please do get in touch with us. So thanks again, and stay safe, and hopefully catch up with you again soon. So take care now. Bye-bye
Bye,
now.
everybody.